Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests today. With me is Christopher Bauer, who is a speaker, author, and consultant on ethics, compliance, and accountability. Nancy Capistran is an executive coach, CEO, strategic advisor, internationally published author, and peer leaders group chair with Vistage Worldwide Incorporated. And Scott Mason, also known as the Myth Slayer, is a speaker, podcast host, and coach working with executives and entrepreneurs to magnetize and monetize professional freedom by dislodging toxic myths to ignite the charisma within. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here. Yeah, as always.
Pleasure.
And here is our topic. In Paducah, Kentucky, neighbors called police, reporting a 9-year-old who set up a roadside stand in front of his house. He held up a sign advertising not lemonade, but ice-cold beer. Officers arrived to find young Colton Ray proudly handing out frosty mugs of root beer, grinning like a kid who just discovered capitalism. I just wanted people to stop and buy some root beer, Colton explained, and boy, they did. Local officers applauded the creativity, and sales reportedly tripled after the incident. Colton told reporters he's considering a lemonade spin-off next under the banner Locally Sourced Moonshine. His parents are both proud and slightly terrified. This story appeared recently in the Paducah Insider, a news satire and parody publication modeled after The Onion and the Babylon Bee. But what if the story had actually been true? Was the ad for cold beer deceptive, or did it merely omit enough information and allow people to draw their own conclusions? When we intentionally blur the lines governing truth in advertising, is that just good business, or does it cross the lines into misrepresentation? What other insights might we find in the apocryphal story of young Colton Ray? The floor is open.
I guess it's never too young to learn bait and switch. Yeah, I think in a way it's a slightly false question. I don't hear this as whether this is deception or not. It is clearly deception, clearly intentional deception. Is it ethical or not? I'm not a relativist in general. Is this earth-shakingly terrible? No. Is it cute? Yes. Is it inappropriate? Yes. And one of the things that I find lacking in the backstory, or I guess whatever you call the story that comes after, is the parents or the police or whomever taking the opportunity to say, this really is misleading, but sort of what's the teachable moment? Let's talk about what might happen if you're deceptive in other ways or to other people or to another degree. And I think and that comes to mind because I find that lacking in so much of the discourse that we have about so many things today, that we're so polarized that there's a right or a wrong. No one takes the time to say, well, what really can we think about that's going to be enlightening to make sure that we're acting in a more appropriate or ethical way in the future?
Yeah, it does remind me of a story I heard a number of years ago where the little boy's name was Kenny. And at the end of the incident, whatever it was, it said, and little Kenny Lay grew up to be the head of Enron.
Yeah, I thought it was playful and charming, but also raises serious questions about trust and truth and leadership, right? Because we lead by example, and if the parents accept that kind of behavior, that continues to kind of snowball into what Colton would become as an adult. And, it bends the truth, but it leads to more disruption as he gets older.
Now, of course, a counterbalance to that it is to me somewhat chilling, but I may be a minority opinion here, is, we do tend to be really appreciative of clever deception. I'm sure there are earlier references, but at least since Machiavelli, we've had people who have been charmed by charming deception, even when it's related to behavior that is ethically questionable, if not outright ethically reprehensible. And of course, now we're in an environment where we're rapidly rolling back consumer protections, for example. So my assumption is that as a part of that, deception is going to be far more rampant, and because of that, ultimately far more accepted just as the way things are done. Now, I hope I'm wrong about that, but that's a strong prediction on my part.
And Scott, before you jump in, you just put me in mind, Chris, that cute deception might actually be much more dangerous
Oh, absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
we all find this story cute and charming and funny, which means that we're much more willing to make excuses for it than we would be in a comparable case by an adult that wasn't quite so clever. Yeah, Scott.
Absolutely.
I can't help but think, as I'm pondering both the hypothetical and the responses given so far, two things. One, to what extent is deception purely culturally defined? One can say, for instance, facts are facts, and anything that steers a listener or someone who's about to buy something away from the facts is deception. But that's assuming that what we consider to be deception in this very hardline sense is a universal standard. And the reason why culture is relevant to me here goes as to the second point that I ponder, which is perhaps we have culturally moved beyond a point where that sort of standard for deception is meaningful at all. An example of this is on YouTube. I would be shocked if any of us has not gone onto YouTube and seen some thumbnail that promises to share the true life, whatever happened to story of some celebrity, for instance. And you see them when they were 20 years old at their height on this television show that you remember, singing that song that went to #1. And then right next to them, they have what purports to be a modern picture of them. And they, have gained 600 pounds, or they have, had all sorts of weird plastic surgery or whatever. And you have to press watch because what on earth, how could so-and-so have become this other individual? And then you watch and you realize that the thumbnail itself was clickbait. And many people, after you have been on social media long enough, come to very quickly recognize what's clickbait. Yet that is socially acceptable. No one is saying clickbaiters are committing anything approaching an ethical crime that is going to lead to down a slippery slope anywhere. And in a way, the example that you talked about is kind of the same as clickbait, because think about it. If you are about to give money to a little boy who's 9 years old or whatever, and is claiming to sell beer, are you looking at what you're buying before you turn that money over? If he's saying it's moonshine, and then you see Country Time lemonade sitting right there, right? It's not like the money was exchanged and then later you find out. The deception is at best, from what I hear, in the marketing itself, but you have the chance to back away before any real harm is done. And so in a cultural context that might be different than this hardline approach, one might say, hey, clickbait isn't really deception. YouTube, for instance, has never clamped down on this, and people watch clickbaity stuff all the time. So I would argue that perhaps in our culture, as it is now, like it or not, he might not be committing any meaningfully ethically dubious deception whatsoever.
Well, I would question your first comment, not because I have a definitive answer, but I just don't know. And that is, I don't know that deception actually is culturally defined as opposed to culturally constrained. My guess, and again, I'm talking off the top of my head, my guess would be that pretty much transculturally people would identify a variety of kinds of deception as deception, but there might be in fact, I would presume there would be a very wide range of responses as far as, well, that's fine, or we do that all the time, or people just know that you're kidding, or that's a part of bargaining. But the whether or not something is deception, again, there may be some research out there on it. I'm not aware of it either way. I would guess that's probably not culturally defined. The other thing that I found my gut tightening a little bit is the idea that clickbait, which I think is a great example, um, is not, I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting what you said, but the way I heard it was that clickbait is not a slippery slope. And if that's what you meant, I don't know that I can hang with that. I think clickbait is simply more culturally available deception that is designed to manipulate behavior based on deception. And you mentioned marketing. Marketing uses that idea all day long, right? Persuasion based on changes in words that are going to affect how we perceive things and how we perceive our choices. But it does strike me as a significant slippery slope ethically.
What
You
about
certainly say that when bad behavior becomes acceptable and it's no longer considered bad behavior, is that because objective rules have changed or subjective rules have changed?
Sometimes both.
Yeah. When I first read this as a mother, I thought, oh my gosh, what are the parents doing having a 9-year-old child selling ice cold beer? Like that was the first thing that was like, oh my gosh, it's alcohol. And what are they doing? And then I saw the picture of, the police with him, like, supporting him. And I thought, what kind of a message are they sending here? So that was a whole nother piece. That was where I first went. And then, the more I thought about it, I'm like, okay, so here we have a 9-year-old who stumbles into kind of an ethical gray area with a Sharpie and a grin. And that's one thing. And then another thing is when a seasoned executive uses smoke and mirrors to drive revenue, right? And so I'm curious to know your thoughts in that area.
Well, I think again, we're in an age, and maybe we've always been, I don't know if this is necessarily new, where deception to some degree or another is just considered a part of how you do business, right? It's either, a literal bait and switch, or,
Or clickbait and switch.
yeah, right. Or promise high, deliver low. There are a whole number of forms, or clickbait in even the figurative sense, but certainly the literal sense, are just things that we've come to have embedded in our culture. Now, whether we choose to excuse it or not is another question that we all have to address both as individuals and organizations. And I also think that organizations need to maybe take more time, so let me back up. A lot of marketing, some sales certainly are farmed out. The bigger the organization, probably the more likely they are to have in-house marketing. But I would say whatever the number is, a huge percentage of marketing is outsourced. And I don't know how much attention organizations pay to what are the marketing tools that those outsourced folks are using, and do they want to, do they need to, should they choose to intervene more and say, hey, that's clever, we love that, but really we want this to be a more accurate representation of who we are and what we do.
I think
And
that's really important.
Well, but I do think that sort of goes back to, and it may be a different version of what you and I were debating earlier, Christopher, which is to the extent to which deception has a cultural component to it. The reason why I will bring that back up, but in a different way, is one group of people might say every literal fact that is in one way or another distorted to present something is a deception. Others might say a deception is something that causes on a fundamental level, and what that fundamental level is can vary, but on a fundamental level to be distorted to those who are perceiving it and possibly engaging in the transaction. So here's something that may go on the border of that. Food advertisements. fast food advertisements. Y'all, I have seen so many Wendy's commercials in my life, and those hamburgers always look, I don't even eat beef, and I want to eat these things. And those who are in the business or who know anything about the world at all know that those hamburgers that they show on those commercials that make you want to go to Wendy's or McDonald's right away are not actual hamburgers that you see off the grill. They are gussied up and dressed up. Is that deception? Should all of the marketing firms or Wendy's be accused of lying to the consumer over and over? Talk about other things too. Actors or performers or just regular people who engage in certain sorts of things like makeup, right? If I were to go on television, I would definitely need to have some makeup done. And I might put some dye on my beard so I could look like the 26 years old that I truly am, right? Would I be committing a deception to the world about what I am? Or are those sorts of changes removed from the fundamental truths as to whatever it is that I'm positioning out there enough that it's not really a deception? It's merely a disguise or an alternate presentation or something like that.
I'll stand by my original comment. I think, yes, it's deception. It may or may not be significant. It may or may not be something that, as you say, fundamentally changes someone's perception. But is it deception? Sure. I think deception is an objective term. How it's applied, the degree to which it's applied, the availability of corrective information, I think all factor into whether it's heinous or not.
We were talking about this before we went live, the literary license, creative license. At what point does it enhance the storytelling? And then you cross a line to it changes the essence of the story. I mean, I often talk about the movies we've probably all seen, based on a true story, or a step beyond that is inspired by true
Right.
event.
Yes.
But one that I think about is if you saw the movie Argo about the rescue of the American embassy people from in Iran in 1979.
Mhm.
So the last scene of the movie, spoiler alert, is there being the planes taxiing down the runway, and you see these black government sedans chasing the plane as it just finally takes off. And I heard an interview with Ben Affleck, who's a producer, and he said, did that happen? We don't know that it did. Maybe it's unlikely that it did. What they were trying to do was to dramatize the tension that they felt. Because until the plane actually got up in the air, they didn't know if they were actually going to get away. So I think in a Hollywood context, I can give them a pass on that. Because the embellishment is there to try to create a sense of the drama that was felt by the people involved. Whereas, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Remember the Titans. Well, it's a wonderful movie. It's a black coach in Virginia. Well, in the movie, his football team is the only non-segregated team in the league. Well, apparently by that point, all the teams were desegregated. So it made for a really powerful, dramatic element. But when I found out what actually happened, I was kind of like, I feel somewhat deceived that I thought I was watching a story about something that really happened, and so many of the fundamental facts were changed that
Yeah.
it really crossed the line way over into fiction.
So that was just thinking about something as you were saying that, and it's more about what's more ethically defining? Is it what somebody's meant to do or what their actions caused? I just think that there's an interesting thing. It's like, well, I meant to do this, but these are the actions. So really, where is that
motives versus outcome?
Yes. So yeah, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on that because, a 9-year-old versus an adult versus acting versus, a story and how it's embellished. I'm
Well,
just,
here's one way to think about it.
please.
So go back to our original protagonist, the kid with the root beer with the ice cold beer for sale, and the police came and said that's terrible. You should never do that. You need to take the sign down. And he took the sign down, and he sold no more root beer. Would that have changed how much or how little his intentions were deceptive?
I don't know if a 9-year-old would have known that he was being deceptive. I think he might have just thought he was being clever
I mean,
at
is
that
root
age.
an adjective or is it part of the noun?
Sorry?
Is root an adjective or is
Oh,
it part of the noun, root beer?
yeah.
And you can change the adjectives. Yeah, that's the rule in advertising, right? Right. Believe the nouns, disbelieve the adjectives.
Yeah, yeah, which gets back to Wendy's, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It just came to mind only because as I was kind of getting ready for us to be talking about this, I was reading a lot of the comments that were in this post about this story. And there was so many comments that were about, oh, he's going to make a great marketing executive. And, so is that because to your points earlier, that's the norm, that's what's expected, that's what's happening? Or, I don't know. I just thought that was it was fascinating to read all of the comments.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and I
again,
really
I
like
think we tend
your
to be quite adoring of clever business, right?
sure,
Whether
especially
it's
kids.
ethical or not.
Yeah. Yeah, with that cleverness we find very, very appealing. But to your point, Nancy, um, I think both the elements of motive and outcome need to be evaluated independently.
Mm.
There is a famous road that's paved with good intentions. Uh, and the best motives can and often do result in a tremendous amount of damage. Um, on the other hand, sometimes people just get lucky. They meant to do something wrong and it turned out right.
Yeah.
How much credit do they deserve for the good that they caused when they had absolutely no intention of doing it?
Mhm.
Um, in this world, we tend to put more weight on outcomes. From a theological point of view, there's more weight we put on intentions. But really, I think both are critical factors to contemplate, especially when we're talking about ethics.
Agree.
You're
Yeah.
looking really pensive, Scott.
I can't help but also think about, to the extent that the nature of the transaction that's being represented, or the nature of the story, or um, potentially unethical behavior vis-a-vis those that are being deceived, goes into the equation more than the discussion so far has acknowledged. So, for instance, what we might find acceptable in a purely storytelling and entertainment context, or a fable sort of context, a moral a situation where you're attempting to tell moral stories, might be very, very different than a commercial context. My favorite author, the great sci-fi writer Gene Wolfe, said that all great fictions are true, and so many truths are actual lies. And from a moralistic perspective, I understand what he's saying, but that's not really factually true, too. And I might feel very differently hearing that in a purely storytelling and uh, thought engagement situation than if I were to have bought something from someone and they were saying to me the exact same words. Well, all great truths are fictions and all fictions are lies. So just, you're not going to get a refund on this thing I lied to you about.
Yeah,
And
sure. I mean, I think that's what we call stories, right? That there is an implied license. Now again, I think we have to be on, we were talking before we went live about attributions. I think we have to be clear about, accurate attributions. But if you pick up a fiction, if you pick up a novel, I would assume most people don't give a second thought to whether or not it's factual or not. They're picking it up as a piece of fiction.
Is there really a responsibility for the buyer and the seller when it comes to like ethical, in sharing that responsibility? Like if somebody is selling something and we know maybe it's not ethical. Do we buy it to support it and encourage the more of that, or do we not?
I'm not actually sure what you're asking.
Now, can you rephrase that, Nancy?
Yeah. So if you think about people that there's always somebody that's selling something and somebody that's buying something. Let's look at Colton, right? So he was selling root beer, but was putting it out there like it was ice cold beer. And people who were driving by were stopping for the ice cold beer. So what are they supporting? A 9-year-old saying that, he can change it up a little bit and be playful, but yet not truthful in what he was selling. And they were supporting it by buying it. And he was selling more and more of it because they found it to be a catchy way of doing it. But it's encouraging him to continue to look at falsities and saying not so favorable things to be able to get people to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sure. If I pull a deception, I get away with it.
Right.
Then I'm just encouraged to do more of the same.
Right.
Which is often why we want to teach children these lessons when they're young,
Yes.
so they won't suffer the consequences as they get older. So yeah, you could say that the police in the story and all of the people who bought from him were contributing to not so much the delinquency of a minor, but maybe the delinquency of an adult that he's
Well,
going to go
encouraging
into.
him, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Reinforcing deception.
Yeah, reinforcing moral decay. I used to own a company that was in the apparel manufacturing space and apparel decoration space. And I cannot tell you all how many times people came in there saying, we only want our clothes to be American made and ethically sourced. So we showed them that. Then they would react in shock and then say, okay, show us the cheapest whatever. We don't really care if it's made in sweatshop in some foreign country and people are dying along the way. All of a sudden, when they saw the prices, they inevitably bought the one that was the least ethical possible, but was cheap. And so I do feel like ignoring the responsibility of those that engage in a transaction with someone who it might be engaging in morally dubious behavior, it can be really ignored. And it's an important part of this particular situation because the market could easily act more effectively than anything, but the market obviously wasn't, or no one would have called the police.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And again, in our current political environment, at least in this country, where consumer protections are getting rolled back, I think, like I said earlier, I think it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be significantly greater misrepresentation and significantly greater acceptance of it because there's going to be fewer choices.
And of course, as this sort of thing becomes more and more common, I mean, this sort of thing meaning playing games with the truth, people's tolerance for it increase. And I mean, this is what I talk about in my ethics programs, that, we're swimming in an unethical culture, which makes it harder for us to maintain our own ethical standards.
Yeah.
And
more,
what you were talking about, Scott, in terms of the clothing, I think everybody likes the idea of doing things the right way. How much inconvenience, how much expense. We had a program a few weeks ago about Amazon, that many of us feel that Amazon is really not a business company we want to support, and yet we all do business with it because it's so hard not to.
It's like the norms are continue to shift in sometimes not the best direction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yet reality does not shift. And reality does not pay attention to the convenient lies that we tell ourselves many times. And that's the tragedy of this, is that it does leave us very, very vulnerable.
Yeah, and Christopher, I'm sure you're familiar with the term situational ethics, which is a term I despise.
Noted. Yeah.
The idea that that ethical values change depending on the situation,
Yeah.
right? Which I believe is absolutely false. I think they're absolute, but situations do change, and the application of ethics, you're going to have different competing values that you have to choose how to prioritize because we can't always honor all our values at the same time.
Yeah.
And that, once you get into the judgment realm and the grappling with the gray, then it's so much easier for us to start rationalizing that, okay, this just doesn't rise to the level where I need to be concerned with it. But
Yeah,
it's what
I
And,
comes
and
talk.
I would
after that.
actually, I would turn up the volume on that actually in a way and say that that's actually consciously or not, always an inner dialogue we have. It's just different situations, we're going to be more or less conscious of it. But I think we're always to some way weighing, is this so, is there a risk that this is so against my values that I simply can't do it? And making a judgment, right? Situation by situation. So I think that's at least nominally universal.
Yeah, in fact, I just had a situation arise where we're finishing our basement, which my wife has been wanting to do for the last 29 years. And so she's very happy as we're getting towards the end.
Yeah.
But we had hired a dumpster to be in our driveway. And then I got the bill, and if I interpreted the bill correctly, which I still need to investigate, they had charged me for the dumpster, but they didn't charge me for all the time that it stayed in the driveway. And I found myself going through some very, you know, belabored internal calculations over whether I should bring this to their attention.
Mm.
To the point where I went and I asked one of my trusted advisors, and he said, "I don't really hear the question." And I said, "I guess I don't really either."
Huh.
But it is, it is a strategy that when we find ourselves, somebody once said, you rarely have to talk yourself into doing the right thing. But when we have people in our lives that we can check in with that have that objectivity that can tell us, you're not really on solid ground here, and say, yeah, I kind of knew that. I just needed somebody to tell it to me.
Yeah.
Then it becomes easier to stop looking for reasons to do what we kind of know we shouldn't be doing anyway.
Well, but that then to me raises a very interesting ethical question, which I personally had never I thought about, but not this hammer on the nail way, which is to what extent do we actually have an affirmative obligation to surround ourselves with those who have strong ethical compasses and will speak them.
I certainly do lots of work with lots of people with whom I have very fundamental foundational disagreements about some what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes we can have those conversations, sometimes we can't. It doesn't, well, I was going to say it doesn't interfere with our work. It doesn't always interfere with our work. If it does, then I need to say this is interfering in either, and we need to do something about it, or it's not appropriate to work together. But I certainly try and surround myself as best as I can with at least some people in my life who are going to listen as objectively as we ever can listen and give direct feedback if they think something is not up to snuff.
And one of my favorite quotes is from Jim Rohn, who said, "You are the average of the five people you spend most of your time with." And
True.
Scott, I'm completely on board with you that I think it is an ethical obligation, an imperative, to choose the company that we keep. It doesn't mean that we never interact with people who may not be up to our standards. But you know what they say, if you're the smartest person in the room, it's time to find a new room. If you're the most ethical person in the room, I think you can make the same case
Yeah.
that we want to surround ourselves with people, or at least associate with people who are going to challenge us to stretch ourselves
Exactly.
intellectually, morally, because Bob Dylan said, "He not being born is busy being born is busy dying."
Mm.
Yeah. I talk a lot about situational leadership with my private clients and my Vistage members. And a lot of it is around, making decisions, ethical decisions, right? Because sometimes nobody's watching, but you need to still be doing those things because it really is your brand. And people like your staff or what have you, they find out about this is the decisions you make. And once you lose that, you can't get that back. And
Yeah.
so I think it's really important that people think about the choices that they're making, right? And sometimes it requires us to pause a moment to say, is that really the right choice? Because we don't want to compromise that. And when we do, it does compromise our personal brand.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
public and
And I think
private
one of,
behavior becomes public behavior, even if people don't find out what I did in private.
Yes.
I'm now much more likely
Hmm.
to have that behavior spill over into the public arena.
yeah.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that's actually sometimes lost in leadership training and management training for that matter is the idea that everyone's a model, right? We put so much emphasis on tone from the top. Not that that's unimportant, but we forget that there's tone everywhere, right? We're all a model for someone else on the job and off. And I think we need to make sure people understand folks are looking at us and they're looking at what gets the nod of approval, what gets ignored, what doesn't. And every one of us has to make the decision to be the best model we can in the greatest number of situations, which sounds sort of weirdly burdensome as I hear myself say it. But I still think that it's something that we have the obligation to do.
It really,
It's so true, Christopher. One of my most popular leadership courses is on how a leader should manage high performing nightmares or toxic superstars.
mm,
And one of the things that people seem genuinely surprised about, but they don't really argue with when it's pointed out, which is that if you're the boss, you may be as ethical as can be. But when the person who's reporting to you is unethical or acting out in all sorts of crazy ways, the staff doesn't blame them. They blame you.
so true. See
Yeah.
it all the time.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, you remind me of one of my favorite movies, Miracle, about the U.S. Olympic hockey team,
Hmm.
where he's trying out the players, and he comes up with his list, and his assistant coach says, "Well, you've left off some of the best players." He says, "I'm not looking for the best players. I'm looking for the right players," because he had a vision of how he's going to create a team, and everybody thought he was nuts until he won.
I think there's a lot of CEOs or, key decision makers that don't realize what they're letting go by with these high performers or, the people that are the rock star sales reps or what have you, and they just turn a blind eye. And it really does make a meaningful difference when the people see that you're putting up with that and you're saying that that's okay when it really isn't. And it's just remarkable how many people stall out in making those permanent changes that they should.
Yeah, one of the things I find myself talking about often in my programs is, the relevance of certain attributes that we reinforce, and people talk about the importance of passion in our jobs. And one of the things I talk about is how many of us, have days or weeks or months or years where we're not the least bit passionate about what we do, and we do a great job. And on the other hand, is there ever a more potentially dangerous employee than a highly passionate, incompetent employee?
Yeah.
They can do a lot of damage fast.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure. And a lot of times people don't come forward until after the individual is finally let go. And then all the stories come out and it ends up being much worse than they originally thought it was.
Yeah, and that could actually lead into a whole other topic. Maybe we'll get into it in the second segment, um, when the idea that compassion, um, what appears to be compassion, may in fact not be, and what appears to be
Yeah.
a little more ruthless or strict attribute of judgment may in fact be more compassionate,
Hmm.
Yeah.
because you're really honoring the welfare of the whole. And by trying to accommodate one person who is really toxic, you poison the entire atmosphere, and everybody suffers eventually, even that person himself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's end this part of the conversation. If you would like to be privy to the backstage conversations that we sometimes have, please feel free to go to my Substack. Look how you can become a premium member and gain access to those conversations. If you have topics that are any topic, more than one topic you'd like us to take up in a future conversation, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com, use the contact information, submit your idea. If it's compelling, we will take it up in the future. And until then, we continue, as always, to encourage you to grapple with the gray.